Okay, good. I think everyone should be able to see my screen now. So I mentioned, the MSL Society is the only nonprofit organization dedicated to helping MSLs advance in their career. We accomplish this by offering numerous resources unique to the MSL profession, including live MSL communication and presentation skills certificate program training, original research, and conducting global focused surveys on the MSL role, including our recent surveys on, as you can see on your screen there, MSL KPIs, job satisfaction, MSL performance. And all of these we offer the full results of and the reports of these surveys for free to MSL Society members as well as those who participate in the surveys. And so for those of people out there on the line who are not members, we certainly encourage you to do this, to join the MSL Society. You can do that. You'll see that on the link on the bottom right of the screen. One of the newest resources that we're particularly proud of is the launch of the first peer-reviewed journal, the MSL Journal, and we officially launched this at our recent annual conference, and all members of the society receive a complimentary digital subscription to the journal. And so we're always looking for quality articles, so anyone interested, please submit them through the journal website as well. And finally, I wanted to mention our latest resource you can see there on your screen, and a reminder that we're conducting the second annual Global MSL Salary and Compensation Survey. And we had a great response last year to our first survey, which included around 1,300 MSLs and managers from 65 countries that participated. This is the largest database of MSL salaries in the world. And so our goal for the 2015 survey is to get an even greater response and include as many MSLs as possible for all countries. And like last year, we're conducting this to gain insights into current global MSL salary and compensation levels across the pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device, and other healthcare industries. So we'll also compare the results from 2014 to 2015, and we're going to be creating this full report of the results. So we expect to publish that at the end of this year, and so we'll share the results of those who have participated as well as all members of the MSL Society. And so we really are asking and encouraging you to participate and to help us build this great resource. So, we're focused on the global MSL community and the evolution of the MSL career. And today's discussion on board certification for medical science liaisons is a very important factor in the progression and strengthening of the MSL profession. And this is clearly demonstrated by the fact that we've had around 250 MSLs, managers, directors, VPs, and various others from about 34 countries that have registered for today. And we're fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Hudson Garrett. Hudson has a wealth of experience in creating and launching certification programs. In a few moments, he's going to share his insights on the importance of a certification program for MSLs. But before we get started, I just wanted to do a little housekeeping, make sure that everybody, for those who have not used GoToWebinar, can follow us and understand. I want to go over a couple of very quick technical details. As participants, you can hear us, but we can't hear you. However, in your control panel, you'll notice you have a chat box. We encourage you to type in your comments or questions in the chat box. And throughout the presentation, we'll address questions at the end of Hudson's presentation. For anyone who might be experiencing difficulty hearing us, just make sure that the volume on your computer or headset is turned up, and the same for anyone dialing in. And also ensure that you're logged into the webinar on a computer or device so you can see the slides presented throughout the presentation today. And then finally, we have been asked by several people If this will be recorded, the answer is yes. This is being recorded, and it will be available on the MSL Society website for everyone. It'll be open to the general public. It'll be available very soon. We just need a few days to get that up. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Hudson Garrett. As you can see, Hudson is the Vice President of Clinical Affairs at PDI. He also serves as the editor-in-chief of the MSL Journal. He's leading this new MSL certification initiative offered by the MSL Society. Hudson will share what a certification is, maybe just as importantly, what it is not, and the purpose of the certification, which is going to be the first in our industry. Hudson has extensive experience in creating, launching, and leading certification programs, and he's going to share his perspective on the importance of a board certification for MSLs and provide perspective as a current manager, as an MSL manager and team leader. We'll also try to incorporate as many questions as possible throughout the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hudson and let him take it from here. Hudson?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Samuel, and good afternoon to everyone on the call and around the world. As Samuel mentioned, my full-time job is I'm the Vice President of Clinical Affairs for PDI, which is a global privately owned pharmaceutical company that specializes in the areas of, we have medical devices, OTC, RX, as well as cosmetics, both EPA and FDA regulated, and so I'm responsible for the clinical organizations. Just a disclaimer from my legal department, obviously the views that we're talking about here are my own personal views and not those represented in my organization. And as Samuel mentioned, we're really going to try to talk in depth about the certification process in general and why the timing of now. I think, Samuel can speak more than me that we've had so many different requests about how do we advance the career, how do we standardize practices, how do we actually demonstrate to end user customers the benefit of the medical science liaison role as it continues to expand and grow across the globe. Just a little bit about my certification background. These are the areas that I've worked in over the last 10 years. Vascular access, nursing, medicine, food safety, and oral health and safety is the most recent. So I do have a love for certification, but I also have a cautious approach to it because I think it's one of those processes that can be very beneficial for all involved, but it can also be very detrimental if there's misunderstanding and more of the nomenclature of the terminology. As Samuel mentioned, I'm going to talk about what it is and what it is not. So here are the objectives for today's program, really specifically looking at the advantages of the professional certification and specifically the timing. I think that timing is so important in this area. 5 to 6 years ago was probably not the right timing, but now with the FDA and the increased regulatory scrutiny around the pharmaceutical industry, medical device industry, there's a lot of pressure that we need to think about. And how can we proactively respond to that and self-regulate versus allowing regulation to happen to us? I'll review the pathways for how this certification was created and also talk a little bit about some of the future ideas that we have and would certainly value any and all input that you might have. So I would encourage you to certainly respond to the survey and send that into the chat box, and I'll get to those questions here in just a moment. And then the last piece, which is equally as important, is really what's the benefit? We've got to understand the benefit to certainly the society as we grow the profession, the employers, our employers have to find value in this, and then our end users and or patients that we mutually serve. So let's start with the why, because I think all too often in healthcare in general, we get to the what and we forget the why in general. But as I mentioned before, with the FDA continuing to evaluate their regulatory guidance, how they're going to increase that, and really just a growing demand for the MSL profession. I talk to customers frequently that say, I really appreciate what your team has done for me because it is so much more beneficial for me to improve my practice by talking to an MSL versus relying on sales and marketing collateral from a marketer or a sales professional. And so I think that value is being increasingly demonstrated by our end users. And certainly, this is one of Samuel's big pet peeves, is we want to try to self-regulate if at all possible. And we know that the FDA regulatory scheme and structure continues to become more and more broad. If we look at just what's happening right now in the world of off-label promotion and inquiries, there's a lot of debate going back and forth with litigation and lawsuits. And so we've got to think, how can we actually arm the MSL profession with more and more integrity through the professional certification process, as well as other professional advancements like the journal. I did want to share this from the Institute for Medicine because I think it's interesting to look at this. So the Institute for Medicine publishes multiple different reports, but the one to Error is Human, Building a Safer Healthcare System is one of my personal favorites, and I took a quote directly from there that you can see. So health professional licensing bodies should implement periodic reexaminations and relicensing of doctors, nurses, and other key providers. But specifically, they address certification by saying it provides ongoing validation of specialty experience, knowledge, and skills. And the whole purpose of this report was not just to look at healthcare in general, but specifically to look at errors, adverse events, the culture of safety, and how do we move forward. So this was really released before healthcare reform took hold, but it talks specifically about the relationships that we have to have as healthcare professionals, whether you're providing clinical care or in an MSL capacity or in an academic setting, it really doesn't matter. Every individual plays a key role, and certification has been widely recognized as one of those ways to improve the profession, advance it, as well as allow individuals a layer of career advancement also. So I did want to start with some common misconceptions, if you will. Specifically, certificates are thrown around quite commonly as certifications, and they are not the same thing. So a certificate there's two different types. There's an assessment-based certificate program, what we would call as an ABC, and then there's a regular certificate, which we would kind of call a certificate of completion. So I'll start with the certificate of completion. You go to a course, you sit for the prescribed number of hours, there's no assessment or anything. There may be a course evaluation of rating the course faculty in the room and those types of things, but nothing more than that. And that's a certificate of attendance. So you're only required to attend the sessions. There's no other activity to validate your knowledge. That is extremely common out there. So you'll hear certificate programs and this and that. A certificate, though, does not actually grant you any type of credential. And so the credential is something that only comes with a certification process. The second type of certificate program, which is becoming more and more common, is actually an assessment-based certificate. And that really is something that is newer as a concept, but is probably going to become much more popular over the next 5 to 6 years. And the difference between the two types of certificates is that the assessment-based is just as it describes, it requires an assessment. So there is a written test or some other type of cognitive validation of knowledge that's required. And that is typically something that is done online or right there in the actual course itself. So it's not something that you would go to a testing center and take a secured proctored exam. And again, with this program, you do not get a credential. So that's one of the big differences. And certain organizations may have what they term a certification internally. Certifications are widely recognized as things that are valid outside of one's institution. So it has to be something that's independently validated as well. We talked about the two different core types of certificate programs, but there's also curriculum versus knowledge-based. A curriculum-based certificate is one where you complete a required set of courses, and then you would either take a test or be validated through just the passing or completion of those, whereas a knowledge-based is much more of a cognitive drill down, if you will, where there's specific objectives and they're tested. And so one is not better than the other necessarily. It really depends on the content area that we're talking about, but you'll see them both widely used in the space of health and medicine and nursing and pharmacy. So a certification, however, on the other hand, is a process that is voluntary. And I really want to stress this because I know in many fields, especially those that I've worked in, there's initial angst about the term certification. And so certification, for the most part, is not a mandatory process. There are a few exceptions to that. I'll give you one that's very recent and rightfully so. Many of us have been monitoring the news where there's been outbreaks of a CRE-type bacteria associated with certain types of scopes that are used in the human body, leading the FDA to a mandatory recall and some other very negative news media out there. That has led the state of New York to require certification for central sterile processing technicians, which are, just for perspective, some of the lowest paid individuals in the healthcare arena, particularly in the basement of the hospital. And so they have recognized there's a patient safety risk associated with that, and as such have passed actual regulatory action that requires a national certification for those individuals to be able to work in that setting. That is a few and far between activity. However, I would say that I anticipate that type of action becoming more and more common. So I think that certification is really going to help create a minimum set of competencies, if you will. The certification also requires an examination process. And so it's one of those things where there is a standardized exam. The exam formats can differ. And what I mean by that is that no two people should get exactly the same questions every single time. So there is a bank of questions that is pulled from. There's also a more advanced type of certification that's called adaptive testing. So, for example, if you start, let's just say Samuel was taking the exam, and he was really acing the exam, it would continue to escalate the questions until it got to the top echelon of the complexity of those questions. And if he continued to pass those, then he would actually be able to complete the exam probably quicker than someone who is not passing that same level of complexity. So as you adapt and continue to either do well or not do well, it adjusts those types of questions. So that's one of the things to think about. From a psychometric standpoint, this is really the principles of making sure that the exam is sound. No one wants to take an exam that is going to be a joke, one that's going to be excessively hard or excessively easy. And so there's a lot of validation that has to go into that by setting the cut score. And the cut score is established after a period of beta testing. It's done to look at what are the average scores, not just overall, but specifically by each individual question. And so each question is written according to certain standards for accreditation. And we also recognize that the questions may change, and especially in the pharmaceutical medical device industry, things change on a daily basis sometimes. And so we recognize that, and we'll continue to improve the exam as we go. On average, the exam will be updated in a major way every single year. And as the job analysis changes, that typically happens every 5 years. And that job analysis is really looking at what is the perspective that a typical MSL has on their role? What are they doing on a daily basis? What is a manager doing on a daily basis? So that those key functions are captured within the scope of the examination itself. The life cycle is one of the things that you have to think about too, because you want to make sure that not only is it sound initially, but it can maintain its reliability throughout the life cycle of the examination. So we've talked about everything up through the cut score, but one of the other activities is external accreditation, which usually takes several years to go through that process. And then the biggest activity that takes place is what we call item review. That item review is you take the existing pool of questions and you continue to evolve it and make sure that it's still, the references are still correct, and also that things have not significantly changed. So that can be done on a more regular basis, whereas the job analysis, as I mentioned before, typically takes place every 3 to 5 years. And that really is helpful at looking at significant changes within the industry, and that is done with the constituents. So, for example, it's one of the things where when we look at how professionals continue to evolve, we know that there's internal training requirements, sometimes external training requirements. The certification is really going to try to encompass things that we know are required for the general MSL function. So they're not going to be therapeutic area specific, which is a common question that we're asked. The certification itself will yield the credential MSL-BC, so Medical Science Liaison, board certified. It's going to be the entry-level requirement for an MSL function. And what we mean by that is that certification does not mean that you're at the top of your game. It really means that you have demonstrated the core competencies required based off the job analysis to be a functional medical science liaison. And it's only assessing cognitive knowledge. It's not assessing your physical skills. So there's no way for us to test you through a certification exam that you can deliver a presentation. Obviously, that would require an in-person assessment, and that could be very, very subjective. This is really more of an objective cognitive exam looking at specific sets of knowledge that has been deemed necessary for the typical MSL to be able to understand and utilize. The actual questions and really the content knowledge was created based on a pool of different types of MSLs and MSL managers. And so we've used many of Samuel's contacts to do that. to look at specifically how can we make sure that it's diverse enough but specific as well, that somebody who's in the field gains benefit from this, but also those individuals that are in management also will be very represented within the job analysis as well. So again, the certification itself is that entry level of competency, and it's not saying that you have to do this in order to be an MSL. It's certainly saying that if you want to differentiate yourself further beyond just your traditional education and experience, that this is yet another way to do that. Just as doing professional presentations, publishing journal articles, et cetera, they're all part of that career pathway. From an eligibility requirement standpoint, we're going to require that the individual either be currently working in the field or serving as a consultant. We certainly understand that there's consultants out there that may not work full-time for an organization. And then we also have students that are in graduate programs. Particularly, we've had tons of requests from individuals enrolled in 5-year pharmacy PharmD programs. And so we want to make sure that they have the opportunity as well to enhance their knowledge as they want to enter the space. So it's not just designed for people already in the MSL space and working currently as an MSL, but also for those professionals and students that are interested in actually pursuing a career. From an educational requirement standpoint, a bachelor's degree or equivalent is required from an accredited institution. If you have a graduate degree, certainly you're way above the requirement. And this is very, very typical for other certifications as well. As we look potentially at things like an advanced MSL certification, that would require a graduate degree or higher. Let's talk a little bit now about the correlation with the roles. I mentioned specifically that the MSL and the MSL manager are included in here, so we tried to keep it, again, as specific as possible to the direct MSL role. And we also understand that there's knowledge-based pieces like that are tangential. Maybe you have exposure or experience with regulatory affairs, off-label promotion, how do we handle adverse events and customer complaints, clinical research. And so there are some basic questions related to those 4 areas on the examination, nothing specific enough that you would have to do that role as part of your normal job all day long, but looking at specific things like how do we handle an off-label event? What are some of the principal elements of clinical research, if you will? So these are the domains for the actual examination. Said that if you look at the domains, they're really broken down by core areas of knowledge is the best way I can actually explain it to you. And these are the areas that were identified from the job analysis that most MSLs are either responsible for, maybe it's an MSL manager or a senior MSL, or are specifically doing as part of the day-to-day work. So building industry partnerships, certainly a no-brainer. You know, collaboration, what are the core concepts of pharmaceuticals and medical devices? With healthcare reform, we thought it was very, very prudent, and the feedback came back to include essentials of health economics and healthcare reform, so that we could talk more about, you know, the ACOs and how that impacts modern healthcare. How do our products and services that we may work with impact those as well, all the way down to working with key opinion leaders, you know, building those relationships, ethics, professional development, and principles of drug development, as you can see there. So it's a very wide variety of topics. Again, it's designed to be a general exam, so you're not going to see very, very detailed questions that would require an attorney to answer or a regulatory affairs professional. But again, that core competency knowledge that we should all know and have probably already received through our company training. The exam format is another common thing that people ask about. The exam, and I think this is a very progressive move, will be offered anywhere. So you will not have to go to an actual testing center or brick and mortar testing center. That's really something that is starting to be phased out for many certifications, not all, but many, with the entry of the secure computer-based testing format, where there's actually a remote proctor through a webcam that is monitoring everything, not only that you're doing, but also on your screen, and can, you know, shut down the exam if there's any type of compromise that takes place. You know, part of this is to increase availability of the examination so that you can take it anytime, anywhere. We don't want you to have to do it between 8 and 5, Monday through Friday, because we understand that that's taking time away from work. And so you may want to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning where you have time, or you may be in a global setting. We certainly have lots of representation in the society from global members, and we want to be very sensitive to everyone's needs and schedules. And we feel very confident in this delivery system. The actual number of questions, as you can see, there will be 150 questions. They'll all be in a multiple choice format, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that. And specifically, there'll be what we call recall analysis and application format. So recall is just very simple, where we're trying to actually recall a specific fact, figure, or statistic, and we're bringing that down. So those are the most elementary types of questions. So that's the least amount that are on the test. And then analysis and application are really taking core concepts and, as the name implies, actually applying them to specific scenarios. So you'll find that on the exam, there's multiple scenarios that are real-life scenarios based on what MSLs face each and every day, that we want to make sure that they understand how to appropriately handle those. And we pick scenarios where there is a very clear-cut answer. So there's nothing out there that's really, really gray. We understand there's many of those situations, and company legal departments or regulatory teams may differ in the interpretation. And so we try to pick things that were very, very fair examples. And lastly, the exam and the certification process meets the ICE standards. ICE stands for the Institute for Credentialing Excellence. That is the organization that can accredit certification examinations. There are many certifications that are accredited, and there are many that are not. It really just depends. For example, the American Hospital Association has multiple certifications that are offered to hospitals all across the United States and now even the world. They meet the standards for accreditation, but have not actually done the accreditation process. So there's no requirement to do it or to not do it. It's really a matter of personal preference, as well as the financial investment is fairly significant. But it is important, however, that the process in the exam itself is designed to meet those standards out of fairness for every single candidate that takes that, because it really ensures continuity, consistency, as well as the reliability of the examination process. As I mentioned before, the examination will require a webcam, so you can either do that with a built-in webcam on your computer, which many laptops certainly have, or you could certainly go out and purchase a very cheap, inexpensive webcam to use. The exam itself, the questions are pulled from a bank, and so they are randomly generated, not based on you, but based on the system, so that no two people get the exact same examination question. And that's done for a variety of different reasons. And there will also be some test questions on there that are being pilot tested. You won't know what those are, but those questions are not counted against you or for you, so they are completely removed from the score. So if you see some, questions in there that you were very, very unsure about, there's a high probability that they may be being beta tested. And so those are not, like I said, counted against you at all. We are simply looking for statistics on those, and those are usually tested for about a year, and then they're either placed on the exam as permanent questions, or they are removed from the examination based on the statistics. We've talked about the types of test questions, and I mentioned before there is a fair amount of scenario-based work on the exam. And that's by design, because we understand that everything is not algorithm-based, especially in this field, and it always is evolving. And so we wanted to provide real-life scenarios that would be realistic to a medical science liaison's daily perspective. And so this was, again, accomplished through the job analysis process. There are benefits that are for each and every constituent here. And it's not just for us as MSL professionals, but there's benefits to the employer, certainly to the patients and customers, as well as the public. So I'd like to review those quickly. First of all, if we look at us as individuals, and I also want to draw correlations with other industries like medicine, nursing, dentistry, where there is a high percentage of professionals that are board certified in their specialty. There is this perception of increased satisfaction, both personally and professionally, because someone has achieved that level. I know, for example, when I, shopped for my dentist and my internist, that was one of my requirements. I wanted them to be board certified in their specialty, because I know that at least they've met certain criteria to demonstrate their knowledge, as well as a commitment to their profession. So it's also something to think about from a recognition standpoint. And certainly this is not true for everybody. But if you look at probably nursing is the biggest area where this takes place, there are designations now for facilities or companies that have 100% of their facilities certified. There are designations that you can receive from an accreditation standpoint. There's government funding that you can receive. So there's a lot of recognition that takes place both from an accreditation, regulatory, and financial incentive or grant awarding process that already exists out there beyond just the MSL certification. When we look at professional advancement, people define that differently. Some people say, well, I go to a conference every year. Some people say, well, I read my professional journal, or I belong to my professional association. And we know that in medicine in general, that the amount of people that belong to a professional association is actually very low compared to the number of providers that exist out there. And that number seems to be increasing with the advanced benefits that are out there. And when I look at the benefits that the MSL Society in general provides compared to the cost of the membership, it's pretty astronomical and astounding to see the value that's derived, which is one of the many reasons that I belong to the society, in addition to wanting to advance the profession, which the certification is a part of that. There is some data that exists out there about higher wages associated with professionals that are board certified. And so certainly we now have the baseline salary survey that Samuel and the team have conducted, which is going to be very helpful and very timely. And one of the things that we'll be looking for as individuals become certified is we'd like your permission to follow you as you go through your journey in your career and understand, especially, when you get promotions, if you become certified, if you're publishing articles in the journal, how is that actually impacting your specific career ladder? How is it impacting your salary and your promotional advancement? And the last thing that I think is really important to cover is that the credential itself is portable. So, there's some credentials that exist out there that, for example, I'm a trainer in a specific organization, but it's tied to my employer currently. So if I want to take that training and go elsewhere, if I were to leave my organization and go to a different one, I would actually have to retake that entire certification class in order to do that. So that is not at all the case with the MSL certification, regardless of if you have a consultant job and work with multiple companies, or you unfortunately change employers or make a career move. That credential follows you to that next employer. It is owned by you. It is not owned by your employer, and it has nothing to do with your employer. So it is externally recognized and awarded by the MSL Society itself through a third party. So now let's talk about the actual benefit to the employer. If you think about the employer in general, they may say it's one of the things that it depends on who you talk to. When I talk to human resource professionals, for example, you really have a preference for certified individuals in general, and typically when they're looking through resumes and looking at stacks of different people trying to apply for a position, that's one of the things that sticks out for them. So they really, I guess, appreciate that in a way. The other piece too is they look at it from a retention standpoint. If I've got individuals, especially if the employer pays for you to be certified, that's yet another way for you to show value to them, but also for them to really recognize you for your contributions and your commitment to professional excellence. So I think that makes a big difference also. And then if you think about recruitment, it makes a big difference. And I use the example of one of the certifications that I currently work with, which is in vascular access. One of the things that we've been able to tie back to that is really in the increase in safety of providing vascular access services. And so that's an example of where we can tie research back. And so that's going to be one of the objectives of the MSL certification, is using examples that we've learned from other fields of healthcare and applying that here to really track and say, how has this improved your career? Can we get some numbers from you? Can we help look at some of the research perspectives of this? And so that'll be an ongoing project that'll take, several years for us to capture that. But then we would provide that data back to individuals such as yourself that either become certified or interested in certification or might be responsible for the certification budget. And I think we got to look at it from a patient perspective or a consumer perspective. It really depends on who you exactly deal with on a daily basis. Some individuals deal directly with patients, some do not. But patients have specific perceptions about certification that are well documented out in the literature. You look at some of the work from the Consumer Union, for example, they want people that are board certified in their specialty. There is a direct perception of that individual being more competent than an individual that is not. And while there are very few medical specialties that require board certification, it's very difficult to get a job, especially in academic settings, with academic, trauma centers, for example, where if you're not board certified, they're just not going to even talk to you. And so there is this kind of unwritten rule that exists out there. As patient safety demands change, it certainly is a way to help meet that also. And it does demonstrate the facility's commitment or the employer's commitment to professional certification. For example, with vascular access, I personally got my entire team board certified in that specialty, and we received an award from the certification body that recognized us for our commitment to excellence by having our entire team certified. And we've also gotten very positive feedback from our customers that have said, this is really, really cool that you've actually done this and shown the level of commitment. So I think it's something to think about as you market this credential if you achieve it. And then the last piece, which is something that, is not the most comfortable topic to talk about, but there is a public perception or public protection part of this. The public deserves to be protected from credential holders that are not competent. And so there's always that risk of individuals that are not competent taking the certification and passing. And so the way that the design of the certification is to help root that out, if you will, but it's certainly not 100% foolproof. So there are mechanisms in place, for example, if someone, falsifies their credentials, if they, do something that is a moral crime, those types of things, most professional certifications will revoke that certification after due process is conducted. So there is an obligation of the MSL Society to protect the public from professionals that should not be credential holders as well. And it does tell the public also that we're committed to lifelong learning and that we have had some cognitive knowledge validated. It does not mean that you can go out and do a specific procedure or anything like that. It certainly just means that you have the cognitive knowledge that is part of the competency domains that we discussed. From the maintenance and recertification process, so once say that you become certified on January 1st of next year, your certification will be valid for a period of 3 years. Now you may say, well, why 3 years? Well, 3 years is a magical number because 5 years is typically too long, especially in a space that is as regulated as the MSL space. And 1 year is just too much. There's not enough aid that changes, and it wouldn't be fair to you as a professional to require you to recertify every single year unless there were literally life-altering changes that were taking place every single month that we needed to account for. And so you see very, very few certifications actually be less than 3 years, but there's not many anymore that are greater than 3 years either. To recertify, there's two different ways to do that. Options are always good in life. The option I would personally recommend is to do the 30 continuing education credits that'll be available through the MSL Society over the period of that 3 years. So that would allow you to go ahead and recertify your certification credential. Or you can actually retake the exam itself, which I would personally not recommend unless you just like to take tests. But I will tell you from experience that about 5 to 10% of people that maintain a certification actually prefer to take the test over again. Why, I don't know, but that's what they do. So, if you're somebody who wants to do things on an ongoing basis and just take care of it as you go, the CE option is the best way. But if you're also somebody who doesn't mind taking tests and wants to do that, you can certainly do that. So there are options available. Once either of those pathways is completed, the renewal fee is paid, your certification will be renewed. And there is a random audit associated with certification renewals. And so not 100% of people are audited for example, their CE, so it would only be something that's for CEs, it's not for the exam if you retake it in that method. But if you do submit via CEs, there is a random percentage of people that are audited to validate that the information you're providing us is accurate, and that's required by the accreditation standards. So the next thing as we kind of wrap up, and I'll get ready for Q&A here, is how do you prepare for the exam? And there's a couple different ways to do this. I'm speaking from some personal experience as well as some professional experience. I hate taking certification exams. I hate taking tests in general. I literally get anxiety about it. So I certainly feel for individuals that walk up to me and say, well, how do I prepare for the exam? Because I want to do well. And I certainly admire that. And so the way that I always tell people to start is to first review the candidate handbook, which contains the content outline. Everything from how do you schedule the test to how long you have to take the test to if you become ill the day you're supposed to take the test, how do you reschedule it? Down to the actual outline in detail that we have discussed somewhat today is contained in that content outline. And so that's the first place that I go, and I literally get out my highlighter or my pen, and I go through and say, okay, well, I'm going to first identify the areas on this domain list that I feel very confident in, and I'm going to mark those in green. And the second step that I do is I go through that same list again a second time with a different lens and say, what are the things that I feel like I'm not so strong in? And I mark those in red. And then the things that I feel kind of iffy about, I mark those in yellow. And I will start with the things that are in green and yellow first and get those out of the way, and then spend the remainder and probably the bulk of my studying time on the items in red that I don't, either maybe I don't have knowledge on because I don't do them every day, or I'm just a little unsure about my knowledge, and I would spend the bulk of time studying that. The other piece that comes with that is that once you've completed that activity, then go to the reference and resource list. That reference list shows every single reference that every question was pulled from. So there's nothing that was just randomly made up by me or anyone else. They are all pulled from specific references that exist out there in the literature, and you can access those online. And so that reference list is contained within the candidate handbook, which we'll be releasing next week. I also placed in there several sample test questions to give you an idea of the types of questions in the format. So the questions obviously are not ones that are on the exam, but they're in the exact same type of format. So there's three different types of questions on there. There's the recall, the analysis, and the application, so that you can see one example of every single type of question that may be on the exam. And then the last piece is the gap analysis. And so, as I mentioned before, once you've identified your areas of strength and your areas of opportunity, then I would sit down and develop a study plan. We do anticipate providing a study guide that will be available realistically probably in Q3 of next year. So it's probably going to take about 6 months to create that. The study guide has to be created after the exam is launched. So it's not something that you create as the exam is created, because the exam itself can change. So we will be providing that study guide. I will tell you that some people do very well with study guides. Some people do not do well with it. So it's really a matter of personal preference. And I would encourage you to, if you feel good after you look at the content outline, I would encourage you to go ahead and take the exam. Because, I've gotten feedback both ways through multiple certification activities that I've done with other organizations, where people said, I didn't really get that much out of the study guide, or maybe I needed to do a group study effort. I've also talked to many people that have actually done that, where they've got multiple colleagues together. They get together once a week for, a month or so, and they hash it out for a few hours every week, and they go through the content outline as a group and quiz each other. And that's a great way to do it also. We will be evaluating potential future specialty area certifications. These are not set in stone by any means, and we would certainly recruit feedback from each of you that might work in these or other areas that we've not captured here. This is not an all-extensive list, but we do want to look at certificates of added specialty that would be specific to therapeutic areas. So, for example, infectious disease is the area that I work in, and it would certainly be very beneficial to me as a hiring manager to know that somebody can actually go out and get an additional certificate that would be added onto their certification that would show that they have some therapeutic knowledge. It would reduce my burden on training and certainly allow me to onboard that person much more quickly. So these are some of the examples that we're looking at. And then finally, cost. The initial certification will be $350 US, and that will cover your entire certification for the period of 3 years. So if you amortize that over 3 years, you can see it's a very low fee for that. And then the renewal certification, there's two different ways, again, as I mentioned, to do that. If you do it through CE renewal, you'll see that it's substantially less, because we're only reviewing the CE, so that'll be $200. And if you do take the option to do the exam renewal, because we have to pay that testing proctor service, there's an increased fee of $275. And again, that's done every 3 years, not every single year. And finally, before we stop for questions and answers, the examination registration will be opening next week. So there'll be details coming out through the society and available on their website for you to do that. Once your examination actually is processed, you'll receive a letter indicating for you to send certain documents. For example, a copy of your degree will be required. And then once all that is received and put into the file and approved, you'll receive an authorization to test. That authorization to test will come via email, and will provide you instructions on how to set up your examination, when you can take it, how much time you have, etc. And once you receive that, you're actually approved to go ahead and move forward. The examination results will be instant, so when you finish the exam, you will know exactly how you did, so you'll know if you passed or if you failed. There is a score report that's provided. It does not provide details on questions, and that is for exam security purposes, but it is something that you can use. And I do get asked the question, well, what if someone fails the exam? And that is always a risk. There will be an opportunity for the individual to retake it at a reduced fee, and they can take it up to 2 additional times before they have to wait a period of time to do it. And that's really for their benefit more than anything, to allow adequate studying time. So I do want to stop there and turn it over to Samuel for question and answers. My email is up here as well, and then all of this information will be posted on the MSL Society website as well. But I'm very, very honored to have the time with you this afternoon, and I'll turn it over to Samuel for Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Hudson. Should see my screen picture of Hudson back up there again. Appreciate that, Hudson. We have several questions, great insight and overview of the program. I think we'll just jump into it. There's several questions that have come through on the chat, and I will try to get through most of them today. If not, we certainly will follow up after as well. And Hudson has offered his email address. So I would encourage you to reach out to him if we don't get to everything. Let's just start in, first of all, I know you covered it, but just to revisit it, it's come up a lot over the last couple of months since we announced this when you presented this at the conference in Boston. Will the certification be mandatory for MSLs to work in the field?
So, great question. So thank you for whoever sent that in. No, the certification, as I mentioned before, is voluntary, as are most certifications. And honestly, it wouldn't even be the position of the MSL Society to try to make it mandatory because we're not a regulatory authority. So it is literally an opportunity to advance one's career, make sure that you're providing a level of professionalism as well as cognitive knowledge validation. But the only person that, in my mind, could really make it mandatory would be the FDA. And they very, very rarely take action like that from this type of perspective. So no, it will not be mandatory, but something that's optional for each professional to consider for their advancement.
Yeah, that's great. And that leads into actually the next question. As most of the people who are experienced in the field know, globally, the pharmaceutical industry is highly scrutinized. Change is constant. I mean, every MSL I've ever managed, especially new people coming into the industry, I would always say the only constant in the pharmaceutical industry is change itself. Speaking specifically to the FDA, what do you anticipate will be the FDA's stance on certification for MSLs?
You know, that's something that if I got my crystal ball out, I think that they'll be generally supportive of it. I've even had a personal conversation with them about this, and they were very intrigued by the concept. I think, which is a positive thing, that they have had a very positive image of MSLs in general over the last few years and the value that they provide. And I think that's fairly reflective in, the guidance for sharing peer-reviewed information and things of that nature that historically they didn't want to do. So I think they do see the value in that. I would say that if I had to, I guess, again, hypothesize what their opinion will be, that they will say this is a good thing for the industry, and it's also good that we're doing it versus them trying to do some type of regulatory action. They may not come out and say that you need to be certified, but they may come out and say that you need to demonstrate competency in certain areas. And they already do this through the GMP and GCP process when they, come out with investigators and want to see the CVs of people working in specific roles. So they already have some of this happening. It's just not referred to as a certification. So my opinion is they would be very generally supportive of this to, look at a way to standardize practices and also ensure professionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think there's some other vested interest as well about KOLs, and I'll come back to that because there's a question about that. Just in no particular order, I know you already addressed it, but there will be additional therapeutic area certifications available. That's a question. Will there be in the future?
So I think the goal is yes. What we have yet to define is exactly what those will be. My goal is to create a comprehensive longer list, if you will, based on feedback from each of you on the webinar today and also the society membership in general, and even talking to other colleagues like FDA and looking at what are those major therapeutic areas, and then creating specific, what we refer to them as, is certificates of added specialty that would be added on to your certification. So they would not necessarily result in an additional credential, but they would be added on to your additional certification. So you'd have to be board certified already, and then you would take this as an additional way of demonstrating therapeutic knowledge. So I think we're going to start with 3 to 5, ideally, and then those would be created over a course. It typically is going to take about 6 months to create one. So we would pick a short list and start from there. So that process will not start till later this year until we get enough statistics with the general exam to know how we want to, prioritize from that point moving forward. But we're very open to any ideas that individuals might have. So if you do, I would encourage you to email this to me or Samuel, and we'll be happy to add those to the list.
Yep, absolutely. I know you talked about this as well. We got several questions about, how can I best study for the certification, and then kind of compounded with that, what materials will be available to prepare for it, and where can I get access?
Sure. So the best source of information that's also free is the candidate handbook, which will be available with registration next week. That candidate handbook is going to contain everything from the domains that we discussed, but actually provide a detailed content that is something that you can look for to say, okay, well, regulatory affairs, what does that mean? What are the specific concepts underneath that I need to be knowledgeable about so that I can plan and study for that? So that was the first piece. The second piece, again, for people that do not like to take tests, is looking at the sample questions. That's going to be very helpful to give you an idea of the types of questions and the way in which they're formatted so that there's no surprises when you go take the computerized exam. You have 2 hours to take the computerized exam, so you have to know what you're talking about. It's not something you can spend 5 minutes on each question. And so I think that's going to be the next thing. And as I mentioned before, there will be a study guide available later next year. That study guide, if you just study that alone, is not going to make you pass the exam. So it really requires a set of cognitive knowledge also. So it really requires each of that. I will tell you the recommended time to study too, I know that wasn't part of the question, is really between 60 and 90 days. So if you really hit it hard and even spend a couple hours a week for that time period and go through the content outline as well as the domains, you should be very, very successful in your encounter with the examination.
Yep, good. Yep. And so the other sort of part to that, the end of that is, tools available to those that have taken it. Once they become certified, what tools are going to be available to help their employer and maybe even KOLs and physicians recognize their commitment to this professional excellence and being MSL board certified?
Right, and that's something that is so critically important because the recognition can't stop when you receive your certificate. It has to, as your question mentioned, continue to go on. So there will be several different resources. One of the most notable is a press release template that you can utilize either for internal use if you want to use it for like a company announcement or newsletter, or even to send it to news media or your customers. So that's fully customizable for you to insert your information in there to recognize that you've achieved that board certification. The second piece is that with the actual certificate itself, there will be an option to purchase certain resources like customized certificate frames that you can hang in your office or in your home, wherever you may be, that recognize that, as well as some additional things like more Toski type stuff where we'll have a certification pen that you can actually wear on your name tag or on your attire. So things like that will allow you to not only be recognized for people who already know what it is, but also use it as a conversation starter with individuals that might not know what this credential is up front. So the elevator speech that will be provided with the press release will also be helpful so that you can really articulate, what it is that you've been through, how have you demonstrated excellence, and how did you receive your certification.
Yeah, good. We got several more questions here. Try to get through as many as we can here. I know we're wrapping up for time. Several people came back. I know you talked about it, but if you could just touch on it again. What is the eligibility to participate?
Sure. So the eligibility is, from a degree standpoint, a bachelor's degree or an equivalent. So the only, really the exception to that is you may have students like in PharmD programs that have earned the equivalent of a bachelor's but are, going straight through to get a PharmD. And it has to be from a regionally accredited institution. And the other requirement is that the individual either has to be currently working in the field as a MSL or consultant or be a student enrolled in a program. So those are the two core requirements. And we try to be as inclusive as possible to allow both professionals trying to enter the MSL career space as well as those individuals that are already functional MSLs today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's an important point. As we know, many companies have internal training and assessments. They may call it certification, they may call it assessments. How is this different? One of the questions that came up is, how is not only is this different, but another question that came up, and I'll just compound it with this one, how can companies utilize this in adjunct to their own internal training?
So this is a tool and an adjunct to that. So, many companies have extensive training or they contract with different organizations to provide that training. So that process should not change. This would be something that I would recommend not only be done at the completion of their onboarding, but probably after they've had a small amount of time in the field as well to really understand that MSL role and interact, especially with like KOLs and things of that nature. So I think it's going to be best served for those individuals that are, new to the role in a company, have completed the training process, and then have gone out and completed their field training versus, just doing it at the end of the field training. So if you're doing an internal certification already, that certification is not externally validated or recognized. This one would be. So you could continue to do your normal process, and then this would be something that the person could take 90 days after employment or 90 days after they finish their training. So that would be how I'd handle it for companies that already have existing programs, and of course individuals that are already working in the role could take it at any point because they would have already been through the training.
Yeah, and I think that you just alluded to my next question also, as it relates to one of the questions that we got a lot in Boston, and we've already seen in the LinkedIn discussion groups, is how does this impact experienced MSLs? How do they benefit, and what would you say would be a reason for to encourage experienced MSLs? Maybe somebody's got 10 years, 15, 20 plus years. Why now? What is the benefit of them participating in this?
Well, I think that's an individual question. Professional advancement doesn't stop just because you've been in your career for 20 or more years. That experience is extremely valuable. It's something that I certainly have tremendous value on when I look at hiring candidates. But I also place a lot of emphasis on professional advancement that they've taken on their own that's not required. So when someone, only does the core requirements of company training but does not seek certification, and I have someone who has sought certification as an equally qualified candidate, my barometer is going to lean over towards the person that's actually done the additional work and become certified. So I don't think it's discriminatory as to the amount of experience that an individual has. Unless you were simply planning to retire next year or something of that nature, I would certainly understand that. But if you plan to be in your role and continue to advance your role, and also if you're a manager and want to set the example, I think it's important to look at professional certification as an adjunct to professional advancement, career recognition, and really a commitment to professionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other, just a couple other most pressing questions that that was submitted here. You mentioned the CEs that will be offered. The question that came in, where and how will these 30 CEs be offered, and who will be offering them? I know you alluded to that, but just because a few people have asked that question.
Sure, great question. So thank you to those of you that asked it. The CEs will be available through the MSL Society, but there's also additional ways to earn CEs, because we understand that many of you may actually deliver content programs yourself. So if you're going out and offering accredited education to a customer, or you're receiving education elsewhere, there will be a mechanism for you to validate that. So for example, if you're delivering a presentation related to the MSL role, and there's some criteria associated with that, you would actually receive 2 CE hours for that because of the preparation as well as the delivery time. So it's not just that you'll have to take 1 hour of content for 1 hour credit. There are additional ways, or if you publish articles, for example, in the journal, there's credits that you would receive through that. So that's available in the candidate handbook as the recertification matrix. So that would be the way that you can earn CEs, and quite frankly, that would be the way that I would personally recommend you do it, because it gives you so much flexibility based on what your particular career is.
Yeah, absolutely. Great response. Hudson, I mentioned in the very beginning that this obviously is an important perspective, an important potential tool for those globally that are on the call. In fact, I mentioned in the beginning we have people from 34 countries. We've got several people that have written in questions from Brazil, I see China, one from the UK, several from very diverse regions that are wondering, will this certification be recognized globally? And are we suggesting, and what are your thoughts on this providing now some standardization to the role, especially in those areas in South America, Asia, where we would call the MSL role very much developing, and where companies are adopting the MSL role for the very first time?
Sure. So, the exam itself is designed to be global in nature, but as you can imagine, it would be virtually impossible to write an exam that was specific to each regulatory structure of each country. And so all of the resources that are there, you'll see some from places like the World Health Organization and things of that nature. We tried to pull as many global resources that were recognized across the globe as possible, but you'll see that some of the standards are specific to the U.S. And part of that is that the standards are, the FDA standards in particular are used around the world to set policy very, very often. And so you'll see that those things are noted there, as well as the link to access those. So some of the regulatory pieces are probably the things that I can think of the most that are more tied directly back to FDA type standards, because that is the most globally recognized regulatory body. But for individuals that are, especially in countries where this is a newer role, I think this is a great opportunity to create the role the right way up front by having this standardized approach to certification and content validation. So, that combined with things like the MSL Society certificate program, where you can, learn more about the MSL role, I think it would really provide a good career path for those individuals.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the other interesting thing that's happening is, I get invited and speak at several international pharmaceutical conferences on the MSL function in multiple countries a year. And what's interesting over the last several years is what we're seeing, and I think what is relevant to what you just said about, it's impossible to certainly write an exam or have an exam that covers all regulatory bodies. But what's really interesting is that many countries around the world are adopting the U.S. model as it relates to the MSL role and function. And the other interesting thing from our own studies, we know we did a survey last year, and I think that's the relevance of this. We did a survey last year that included 29 countries, and without global standards for the MSL role, what was interesting is that regardless of company type, so medical device, pharma, biotech, company size, or therapeutic area, an MSL is pretty consistent in what they do day-to-day activities, regardless of where they're out in the world. And so I think that speaks to this.
It does. And, one of the other activities that the Society is working on, of course, is looking at that standardization process of what are some of those key areas, like, for example, off-label inquiries. How can we create those best practices that can be adopted across the globe despite specific regulatory guidance? I mean, obviously, you'd always have to defer to in-country regulatory requirements, but this would at least give organizations particularly a way to create best practices that are recognized globally. So that'll be, kind of a step two that will supplement the certification exam as well. But I think anyone that wants to take it from a global perspective will do just fine on it. Obviously, reviewing the reference list is going to be very, very important, especially for regulations that you may not be familiar with. But as we continue to see these global standards evolve, they will continue to be incorporated into the certification exam.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Final two questions here for you, Hudson. Appreciate you taking all the time here. I guess one of the final two questions was just several people asked who created this and who was validating this certification. Can you address that?
Sure. So the exam blueprint was created by a group of MSL professionals and managers with varying different educational backgrounds and experience levels by design, because we need to make sure it's diverse for somebody who's coming into the profession, as well as individuals that might, be at the more tenured end of their career as well. So that's who it's created by. As far as the validation, it's validated by a group of beta testers, and then our intent is to seek external accreditation once we are able to meet those requirements, which you have to have so many people, that several hundred people have to actually take the examination for you to even apply for an application. That would be the next step as well. And as I mentioned before, there's probably about, I would say, 60% of organizations do not pursue accreditation, and about 40% do. And again, that's another layer of sophistication that can be achieved for multidisciplinary accreditation.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Final question and thought here, just to wrap up your thoughts here. As a manager and leader of an MSL team, what do you see as the value of an MSL certification, and maybe you can also touch on rather how would this, if it would, impact your decision to hire an MSL, whether experienced or brand new, someone coming into the industry, or someone with 15 years of experience? Can you talk about that?
Sure. Everybody on my organizational team is certified in a specialty, if not multiple specialties. It is a requirement for our job description. It doesn't specify what they have to be certified in, although I will tell you that effective January 1st, this certification will be a requirement for the roles at my organization, so it'll be part of that and it'll be mandatory. But I really see certification as a benchmark of professional excellence. It shows that an individual took something that was voluntary. They weren't required to do it. They have a demonstrated set of cognitive knowledge. And if I look at it from, let's say I was hiring someone fresh out of school that had the right attitude, was a learned person, had the right educational preparation, but had no experience, if they were certified, that really is going to send me a very strong message that that individual has taken that initiative on their own and has really tried to better themselves. And just as if someone who has 20 years of experience that wants to take it, they're going to get my equal support. So to me, it's experience, educational background, personality and fit, as well as commitment to professional excellence, such as publishing, certification, and presentations at national and international conferences. Those are the things that I look for as a hiring manager to differentiate myself. So if I had two equally qualified candidates and one was certified and one was not, you better believe I'm going to hire the person that's professionally certified. It's just something that I feel very, very strongly in.
I agree. I mean, I think it certainly is a way to self-validate and certainly advance yourself. It's interesting. We talked a lot about here today. Thanks, Hudson, for that. And I think that we talked a lot about, from a company perspective as well as the individual and how they benefit. I just wanted to share one other anecdote. One of the services that the MSL Society now offers is surveying KOLs to gain insights into lots of different things, but certainly how MSLs from a company are doing. And we recently interviewed 200 KOLs from a top 10 pharma company. And among other questions that were brought up from the KOLs, a few of them actually asked us why there's not a certification for MSLs. And interestingly, last year, we were, a year before that, we were in an MSL training program in Seoul, South Korea. They had a KOL there, and he brought up the same thing. So it's interesting to me that even from a KOL's perspective, there is some discussion about that. Any last thoughts on that? Or anything else that, any other comments you'd like to add, Hudson, for this?
Yeah, I've gotten that feedback repeatedly personally. I know, for example, with this vascular access certification, when we first launched that program in my organization, not only do our salespeople do a certificate program, it's not a certification, but it's a certificate designed for non-clinical individuals, but my team actually does the certification for the clinical personnel, and we got outstanding results and really positive feedback from our customers, particularly KOLs that said, this is really cool. Can you tell me about this? And then many of them actually went and pursued the certification, but they found it very, very exciting that our organization had put forth the commitment to professional certification and wanted our people to be the very best in what they were doing. And so we got overwhelming support. So from a return on investment, I know it's somewhat hard to track. I could say that, the money that I spent on it for the team was very well returned by the gratitude and appreciation and, quite frankly, the positive response and encouragement we received from KOL.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I completely agree. We're getting similar comments as well. So with that, Hudson, I want to thank you for taking the time and presenting today. I think great overview. I think this is going to be a great resource for the global MSL community. I know you feel very strong about it. I feel very strong about it. I think it's a great opportunity for MSLs to certainly advance their career and demonstrate another level of professionalism. And I think we're in an era where I feel very strongly that certainly as an industry, we do a terrible job at self-regulating. And the last thing that we ever want to have is some other regulatory body, regardless if it's in the U.S. or otherwise, come in and do this for us. I think it'll be, a very painful process. So with that, I want to wrap up. I just want to sort of final thought today. Just a reminder I know we have several people on the call that are interested in becoming MSLs. We're offering a live online training program for the first time ever on Saturday, December 19th, beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern. It'll be moderated by 3 highly respected current MSL managers who are going to share their insights on how to break in, how to avoid certain pitfalls, how to deal with lack of MSL experience, and other great insights. Everybody that joins us will be able to ask questions directly to these hiring managers. It includes a 1-year membership to the society. For those that don't know, I wrote a book last year on how to break into the MSL role. Everybody will get a signed copy of that, regardless of where you're at in the world. We will mail you a signed copy. So it's just a unique opportunity to directly learn from these managers and what they look for in a candidate. So you can learn more on our main website, and you can register and get more information as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap up today's webinar. Again, I want to thank Hudson Garrett, Dr. Hudson Garrett, for a great overview and his expertise and experience on the importance of certification for MSLs. We will have this recorded. Give us a few days. It will be up on the main website, msls.org, and certainly you guys can review it. And if anybody has any questions, you can reach out to Hudson or myself. Hudson's email, again, is hudson.garrett@themsls.org. And we'll make sure that you guys have his email as well. A few people have asked that. I know that Jeff actually just sent it out as well in the chat box, so you'll see that there. Hudson's email has been shared. So with that, once again, I'll thank each of you, and certainly if anybody has any questions, reach out to us. Thank you very much, everyone.